Thank you, Cam. I need to make two preliminary remarks. One is that, as you know, if you steal someone else's ideas and words, that's plagiarism. If you steal six people's words, that's called research. And this is research. One of the people I've stolen from is myself, so it's not entirely, anyway, so I'm comfortable with that. The other thing is that this is an odd piece. It's curiosity driven. So it takes a strange course from beginning to end, and you may find yourself lost from time to time, but you can ask questions afterwards. I was struck by the fact that when John Howard revived the crime of sedition as something you can be punished for in about 10 years ago, that was the first time for half a century that sedition had been a serious activity in Australia. And curiously enough, the last person who had been convicted of sedition was arrested in Pyrmont. I thought that this is a very loose connection, and I'm not suggesting that it was because he was in Pyrmont that he was seditious, or that there was a lot of it about. But I followed the story from that point, and I do get back to Pyrmont at the end of the talk, but you have to be patient because we're going to go to some other interesting places, two very foreign countries. One is Papua New Guinea in 1960, a country, our closest neighbour and our neighbour that we try to not think about at all. And the other one is the Menzies era, which is in many ways a different country than we now live in. So, to begin, on the 26th of November in 1960, federal police interviewed Brian Leonard Cooper in a boarding house in Pyrmont Bridge Road. He was employed at that time he was employed in Bradford Woolen Mills. That's him. He was employed, and he'd been employed there for a couple of months, which reminds us that 1960 was a time when Australia was still a highly protected economy and there was manufacturing. So it was a different country than we now live in. Prime Minister Menzies and the Attorney General Garfield Barwick personally ordered his arrest and charged him with sedition. In January of the next year, 1961, he was flown to Port Moresby, tried and convicted by the Chief Justice, Sir Alan Mann, in a trial in which only the Chief Justice presided. There was no jury. His appeal, because he had to appeal, having been convicted, to the Australian High Court failed for reasons which are also quite strange, but we may not go there. So he was flown back to Port Moresby and served 2 months at hard labour in Bomana jail, after which he was deported and didn't return to Pyrmont, returned to his family in Melbourne instead. So, who was Brian Cooper? Brian Leonard Cooper was born in 1936, so not much older than some of us in this room. He took a Bachelor of Arts at the University of Melbourne and was clearly a very smart young man. And in 1957, he applied for a post as a cooperatives development officer in Papua New Guinea. He was interviewed and headed the list. He was the most appropriate person to be appointed because, as the selection committee said, he appeared genuinely interested in improving the welfare of dependent people. Before he departed, ASIO officers managed to see him listening to Communist Party speakers at a public event on the Yarra Bank, and that raised the alarm. So he had done two things that would be fatal later. One was that he thought that the Cooperatives Development Officer would be interested in welfare, and he drew himself to the attention of ASIO. The person who was second most appropriate to become a Cooperatives Development Officer was a bloke called Peter Wright. They flew together on the same plane to Port Moresby, and they were instantly hostile to each other. It didn't take long, as for both of them, they didn't waste any time disliking each other. When they arrived in Port Moresby, the ASIO regional director in Port Moresby said that Cooper was very interested in the welfare of the native people, and that he believed that the cooperative section was a good place to effect economic development. Asio advised, however, that the cooperative section was needed to be closely watched because it was the most ideologically delicate area of government. Cooper, they said, could do the most damage if he were foolish enough to attempt to indoctrinate native people with communist propaganda. So another flag went up. Suspicion about Brian Leonard Cooper was compounded by his own behaviour. He had no interest in team sports, he didn't like gambling, and he was teetotal. So he didn't make a lot of friends among his colleagues. He also had an interest in listening to Radio Moscow and Radio Peking. This was brought sharply to the attention of his colleagues, who thought this was really bizarre and teased him and got him going for all his strange behaviour. Later, he compounded these offences by revealing that he was both Republican and an atheist. How many social gaffes can you make at the age of 24? Once he was in Port Moresby, can I have the? Oh, right. They posted Brian Cooper to KVN, which is up here.
I can do that.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's it. KVN. And unfortunately, they sent Peter Wright with him. So here were two cooperatives officers living in a very small town, sharing accommodation and detesting each other. It didn't go well. So another interview with Asio followed a couple of months later. So 2 months after that, he was transferred to Lumi, which is almost on the Indonesian border, without Peter Wright. So he had at least it was a relief for him to do that. When he took leave, he travelled to Japan because he was interested in Japan, I guess. And on his return, he proposed that the cooperatives movement start a soap factory. This was so bizarre that it was ignored by everybody else. Why, it's not entirely clear, because soap is basically made from coconuts and that's what they were growing, but this was not part of the agenda. He also had conversations with local indigenous men, including people called Stal Salum and Somu Segob. Don't remember the names, I'll go back to them. And then in October 1960, he was recalled to Port Moresby because the cooperatives department and Asio thought he was too dangerous to be let alone. So he brought back to Port Moresby and given basically gardening leave. So he became so frustrated about being distrusted and having no serious work to do that he resigned. He probably burnt papers and books before he left the country, and certainly before he arrived in Pyrmont. Found a job with Bradford Knitting Mills and accommodation in Pyrmont Bridge Road. That might have been the end of that story, if not for the fact that, let's just get to the right page, that Asio had a continuing interest in him, and so did Menzies, and so did Sir Garfield Barwick. When he was arrested, the Melbourne family, that's where he was from, their phone was already bugged so that Asio could listen to their reaction to the fact of his arrest. After his sentence, because he had to fly back to Port Moresby to serve his sentence, he didn't return to Pyrmont and eventually found a clerical job in Melbourne University. So now I need to tell you about the Papua New Guinea cooperatives movement in the 1950s and 60s. Brian Cooper believed that the role of cooperatives was to promote New Guineans' economic and political progress. The reality was quite the opposite. The war in the Pacific had exposed Pacific Islanders to extreme violence, fateful tests of loyalty, For example, if the Japanese thought that villagers were communicating with Australian spies, they were shot. When the Australians came back and they found that village leaders had been informing against them, they were hanged. So these were choices of matters of life and death for people who were not very clear where Japan and Australia were and who was likely to turn up next. They were also exposed to unimaginable wealth and power, all of which was snatched away in 1945 when the war ended. The Americans had a tremendous amount of material, tanks, trucks, airplanes and so on. Stuff that they couldn't take away were thrown into the sea. So not only was there fabulous wealth, unimaginable wealth, but it was disposable. None of this made an awful lot of sense to villagers. So the impact on people was profound. Some Papua New Guinean men had been trained as soldiers. It was such an extreme situation in the war in the Pacific that the Australians were willing to put guns in the hands of Papua New Guineans and took them away at the end of the war, naturally. But so they had a wider experience than other people had. Many had worked as carriers for American and Australian soldiers. Generous Americans, because when Americans were fighting in the Pacific War, they had to have ice cream, fresh meat, fresh vegetables, limitless cigarettes, candy, and so on, which naturally they couldn't consume and they gave away. So suddenly, Papua New Guineans were exposed to people who had so much personal wealth that they were willing to give it away. They all disappeared and were replaced by Australian soldiers and officers who had no such largesse to distribute and sometimes hanged them. So this was all very unsettling. Peter Simmergan, a village leader of some repute, put it in this way, and I need to quote him at some length. "Yes," he said to the Australians, "we have helped you in this war. Now we are like cousins, like brothers. We too have won the war. Now, whatever knowledge, whatever ideas you have, you can give them to us. Before, all the little things we did, you jailed us and fined us all the time. But now, what now?" This was a question that recurred for decades. 20 years later, a cargo cult leader called Yali was interviewed by Jared Diamond, who you've probably heard of, and who asked exactly this question. Why are you people so rich and we are so poor? After all, you don't appear to work and we work our butts off. Why is it like that and what are we going to do about it? Jared Diamond then made a global career of trying to answer that question. He hasn't answered it satisfactorily, but it's been terrific for his career. Papua New Guinea villagers at the end of the war knew that they were poor, which hadn't been immediately obvious before, and that poverty was not inevitable. Many communities organized themselves to transform their lives socially and economically, sometimes by building airfields to bring back the generous Americans. There were no schools except mission schools in the territory of Papua New Guinea, because I'll explain that later, but so education was at a premium. So the leaders of these village-based movements were often the ex-servicemen who had new experience and new self-confidence. And it was they who helped to mobilize labor, raise funds, identify social and economic projects, and often devise the rituals to accomplish them. Australian authorities coming back after the war were startled by this and profoundly ambivalent. They were very pleased by the prospect of economic development, but they feared losing control. After all, they never amounted to more than 1% of the population of the territory. They were surrounded by people whose languages they couldn't speak. It was a slightly disturbing situation, and losing control was a constant apprehension. The solution that the Australian administration came up with was twofold. First, they increased the numbers and the powers of KIAPs, that is to say, the patrol officers, the outside men, the heroic men in khaki shorts and long socks who represented the state. The patrol officers embodied all the roles of the state as judge, jury, executioner, census taker, health inspector, and so on. A KIAP would walk into a settlement escorted by armed police and a line of carriers, and through an interpreter discharge all the duties of government. To be a patrol officer, you had to be young and fit. They were often school leavers, often from Queensland. I say that not in a disparaging sense, but invariably they resented the grizzled ex-servicemen and local leaders, and besides that, they had no answer to the big questions that they were asked. They relied on these new men as the link between themselves and the people, and they profoundly resented their dependence. That was one branch of the response. The second branch was to take control of the spontaneous development movements by recruiting cooperatives officers to supervise them. The director of the cooperatives branch claimed that, and I quote, "Judicious introduction of cooperatives to an unsettled area is the best antidote to manifestations of cargo cult." I'll come back to cargo cult shortly. These advisors were given huge powers to determine the scale of a cooperative movement, the membership of it, its plans, its activities, and how it should distribute its profits. Papua New Guineans were perceived at that time as primitive and as natives, so they couldn't possibly manage their own affairs without supervision. Some big organizations, some of these spontaneous organizations, were therefore split on the grounds that it would make them more manageable, but in fact to undermine the leadership of a particular leader. Some small cooperatives were put together with hostile people for much the same reason. Funds were confiscated or moved into trust funds. For example, Tommy Kabu in Papua, near on the south coast, had a lot of contact with the Australian Navy during the war and managed to collect enough money from villagers to buy a boat, because in order to get stuff to market. But it was deemed that it was unwise for these funds to be given to Tommy Kabu, who had raised them, so they were kept in a trust fund for 20 years. So what were the cooperatives to do? Many of the cooperatives people wanted to open trade stores, but that was discouraged. They should grow cash crops instead. So which cash crops? Not sugar, which grew naturally, or pineapples, which grew naturally, because both would compete with Australian produce. Instead, they should grow coconuts or coffee. But the cooperatives officers then rigged the prices because they treated villagers as economically illiterate, and anyway, they were living subsistence lives. They grew their own food, they created their own clothes, built their own houses, so why did they need money anyway? Not surprisingly, members of the cooperatives were often profoundly disappointed and alienated from the process. And it's in this context that it's helpful to think about cargo cults. Their leaders wanted to operate independently, independent of cooperatives officers, independently of the patrol officers. And cargo cult was a handy category for denying the rationality of independent initiatives. Madang, which is where Cooper spent his last stint in Papua New Guinea, was a major centre of cargo cult activity and also a major centre of cooperatives. So, for example, the Yali, whom I mentioned, who spoke to Jared Diamond, was a big deal in the Madang area. So, Having been arrested and sent back to Port Moresby, Cooper was put on trial. He was charged under Section 52 of the Queensland Criminal Code, because that was the code that operated in Papua New Guinea. He was charged with making seditious utterances. In case people are not familiar with sedition and haven't practiced it themselves personally, sedition is defined as acts or words inciting people to insurrection against lawful authority. It's a step below treason, I think. So he was charged under Section 52 with sedition. And the charge said as follows, that he was reported to have told indigenous men in Madang as follows: "You must seize the European police officer and tie him up with a rope to a post and hit him on the head. Seize all the European men and women, keep them in their own homes until you can send them back to Australia. Find out where the rifles are kept, and then break open the stores and seize the rifles. Cut trees and sticks to put them on the airfield so that reinforcements couldn't be brought in. Go and break into the stores and collect the food and drink like rum and beer. I can get a message to the Russians and they will come and help you." An unlikely phraseology for a Melbourne Bachelor of Arts. However, the Crown prosecutor argued that Cooper had what was called prior motivation to commit a crime. Witnesses, including Stal Salum and Somu Sigob, the people the Papua New Guinean significant leaders that he thought would be sympathetic to his views, testified that Cooper probably had malicious intentions. Salum and Sigob were two of the new men, they had war experience, who curried favour and accepted government patronage. Peter Wright then gave evidence and stated that Cooper was addicted to radio peaking and often expressed communist views. Another view that he expressed, and this is, I think, in very poor taste, he thought that a church would actually make a good storehouse for coconuts. So, I mean, his taste was questionable. The ASIO officers also stated that Cooper had a history as a communist sympathiser. 10 local men, including Salum and Sigob, then testified that Cooper had spoken the words that were in the charge. When he was allowed to give evidence in his own defence, Cooper claimed that the men asked about self-government and that he had advised them on different ways in which this could be achieved. He preferred a peaceful organisation through trade unions and political parties. The Chief Justice Mann let the prosecutor question Cooper about his religious beliefs to prove that he was an atheist. He accused Cooper of consorting with indigenous people. Consorting with people is not the same as talking to people. Consorting means you have evil intentions. As it turns out, Mann couldn't believe that Cooper really expected to see an immediate armed uprising. But in his view, this made Cooper's words all the more sinister, even if he hadn't said them. Because his real purpose was, and this I quote, they were all the more sinister because his real purpose was to start a movement which would cause the utmost embarrassment to the administration at a time when international attention is critically focused on the situation of primitive people. That was the gravamen of the real charge. He was found guilty of publishing these seditious words, and therefore Cooper was sentenced to 2 further months of hard labour. He'd been in detention for a while. It was said that he exhibited a marked tendency to veer further and further to the left and towards atheism, which, Chief Justice said, appears to be the fashionable corollary to communist thought. Mann hoped that Cooper would prevent himself from destroying any value that he might still have to society. Cooper then appealed to the High Court in Canberra, and his appeal argued, among many other arguments, that character witnesses should not have been admitted because they had no direct relationship to the charge. The High Court criticised Justice Mann's admission of character witnesses, but they argued that Mann would have been professional enough to disregard the evidence. Cooper was guilty of atheism, socialism, and I should point out, he was not a member of the Communist Party. They were contacted very early in the piece and said they'd never heard of him. He was certainly not a member of the ALP, which was committed to white Australia still at that point. So he certainly was a socialist of some kind, but not in a formal sense. He was a non-team player. He was teetotal. He preferred the company of Papua New Guineans, but sedition. Justice Mann agreed that Cooper did not say what was alleged to have said, but he was identified as a type of person likely to engage in activities prejudicial to the security and defence of the Commonwealth. In other words, the onus of proof was reversed. Because he had strange and eccentric ideas in the context of Port Moresby, he was likely to be guilty, and it was up to him to prove that he wasn't. So the question is, who is it? Who is responsible for this apparent mistrial? Alan Mann, not a very distinguished jurist, but he was the Chief Justice. He merely embodied the local ethos of a tiny and insecure Australian minority. And he may even have had sympathy for Cooper. After all, 2 months at hard labour is not, in the context of sedition, a terribly harsh judgment. It was only 2 years later that a Melbourne professor of law, Denoon, proposed that Papua New Guineans employ lawyers and have actual courts, apart from the Supreme Court where Mann provided. So there were no lawyers around to exchange ideas with. So I don't think Mann was personally responsible. He was just reflecting the ethos of the time and the place. His colleagues all disliked this serious-minded graduate. The fact that he was a Victorian may also have been significant. Most of the patrol officers and cooperatives officers were either from New South Wales or particularly Queensland. This mattered in the 1950s. They didn't like him for consorting with natives rather than themselves, and he spurned their interest in sport, gambling and drinking. Paul Hasluck was the Minister for Territories, which meant that he was in charge of the Northern Territory and Papua New Guinea. He could certainly have done more to save Cooper. Why didn't he? I think of Hasluck as the Malcolm Turnbull of the 1950s. He had a distinguished career as a diplomat before he went into politics in the Liberal Party. He had a very superior intellect, and he knew it, and he made no secret of it in caucus meetings. And he had a disdain for the activity of politics itself. In the circumstances in which he found himself throughout the 1950s, he didn't have to engage in politics at all. The Labour Party opposition always agreed with him. They treated territory business as bipartisan, and his colleagues didn't like him, but they left him alone. So he was free to make decisions entirely on his own. His policies can be summed up in quite simple ways. In the Northern Territory, his function was to make Aborigines disappear by assimilation. In Papua New Guinea, he was to make Melanesians disappear from Australia by their isolation. They were never allowed to come into Australia, and dangerous subversive people were not allowed to go into Papua New Guinea. Development, both economic and political and social, was to be so gradual as to be almost glacial, and there was to be no news and no divisive political issues. So, but he didn't actually initiate, he just failed to protect Brian Cooper. So can we blame ASIO? I spent a long time working on the archives of Papua New Guinea, and I didn't come across ASIO until this episode. I had no idea there were so many of them and that they were so influential. they were in effect like the deep state that we keep hearing about in Egypt and other unfortunate places. They were almost a shadow government. They kept tabs on Cooper, certainly, but Colonel Spry, who was the head of ASIO, actually didn't want to prosecute Cooper. He had to be pushed by Menzies and Barwick. So why did they do that? In the 1960 precisely, Menzies was in deep trouble, economically and politically, and as commonly throughout his career, he resorted to red baiting. An example, I mean, it's not very significant, but it's characteristic. In 1960, Jim Staples was sacked from the Attorney General's department. He was a lawyer and a distinguished one. He had been expelled from the Communist Party in 1956, that's say 4 years earlier, but, said Barwick, this was a fancy way these gentlemen have of disassociating themselves from the party so that they may do more valuable work undercover. That is to say, if you were a member of the Communist Party, you were guilty, and if you weren't, you were certainly even more guilty because you were, and in March, precisely when the trial was being initiated, a very distinguished academic called Max Gluckman was in the Australian National University. He was an anthropologist. He'd done a lot of important anthropological work in Africa, particularly South Africa, and he wanted to see Papua New Guinea. He was denied an entry permit, apparently on the grounds that he was a vocal opponent of apartheid, which you might in retrospect think was a strange reason for keeping him out. Questions were asked about the judgment of Menzies and Barwick in that context. In September, the Sydney Morning Herald, which was not a radical paper at that time or perhaps ever, argued that the use of suspicion as the foundation of policy was not a good way to go. So it's possible that Menzies and Barwick were piqued by the fact that the polls were running against them and the economy was running against them and the newspapers were running against them. They needed a seditious conviction. They may have done this out of pique. So to come to Pyrmont in the 1950s. Pyrmont's isolation from Papua New Guinea was pretty complete. You'd imagine that since sugar grew in Papua New Guinea, it might have come here for processing, but no, that was prohibited by Australian policy. Also, a lot of sailors turned up in Sydney, many of them on ships that came from Port Moresby, but not with Papua New Guinean crews. Papua New Guineans were not citizens but subjects. For a Papua New Guinean to travel to Australia in 1960, there was no possibility of a passport. His or her employer had to get permission to remove a native from the territory. So there wasn't a lot of freedom of movement. So from Pyrmont's point of view, Papua New Guinea might as well have been on the moon. Pyrmont was in Sydney a backwater, but it was also an ALP fief, where jobs were in the gift of aldermen. Remember Edward Wright's story about the incinerator, that when he wanted a job, his dad went to speak to the alderman who got him a job as a sparrow starver, that's to say, sweeping Sydney Harbour Bridge with a broom, and he worked his way up from there. That was the way employment worked. Shirley Fitzgerald and Hilary Golden put it like this way: Labour was the only political party. Membership of the local branch tied a resident into a tight network of support and information exchange concerning jobs, housing and services. The widespread view of things was that all the men worked on the wharves or in the wool stores or for the council, and that the best way of securing a job was to gain the ear of an alderman. The ALP branch in Pyrmont was dominated by John Ignatius Armstrong, allegedly the seventh son of a seventh son, born to Irish parents. He was born in Ultimo, baptized and educated at St. Bede's. He worked and lived in the Butcher's Arms, which is now the Dunkirk, and was probably from birth a member of the Labour Party, certainly until his death. He represented the Labour Party in the Sydney Municipal Council and then in the Senate in Canberra from 1938 to 62, where for some years he was deputy leader of the ALP. He had to be eased out by Lionel Murphy and then returned to Sydney and became Lord Mayor in 1965. So he was Pyrmontese all his life. His final post, however, thanks to a Whitlam appointment, was as High Commissioner to London, which must have been a funny situation for an Irish Republican to think, however. Anyway, he had many virtues. He was a superb local politician, gregarious and generous with his time, his money, and his advice. His national career, however, was shaped by his Catholicism, his Irishness, his republicanism, and his ferocious anti-communism. So a left-wing, middle-class lad like Cooper, who was not a churchgoer, not a trade unionist, not a party member, had no possible allies in Pyrmont. I'd like now briefly to turn to the outcomes for all the people involved. I've mentioned that Jared Diamond, who came across Yali, made a terrific academic career. Yali less so. Salum, one of the people who gave evidence, secured the plantation that he was angling for from the administration. Somu Sigob was nominated to chair a local council and then nominated to represent the natives in the Legislative Council, and enjoyed 2 trips to the United Nations to explain how happy Papua New Guineans were. I actually met him. He became a security guard and driver at the University of Papua New Guinea later, but I had no idea that he had such an interesting and a dubious background. In 1961, Menzies won re-election against all the odds by 1 seat. And the 1 seat that gave him the victory was when Jim Killen won the seat of Moreton in Queensland by 130 votes, including 93 votes from Communist Party preferences. 5 years later, Cooper's ideas had become orthodox. 2 interesting things that happened. John Guise, who was half European, half Papua New Guinean, led a delegation of politicians to Canberra and asked, is it really, we're a territory, does this mean that we can become the 7th Australian state? So there was an emergency meeting of cabinet to say, no, whatever, you're going to be independent. And that's really when policy suddenly did an abrupt change. But the second thing that happened was that the United Nations sent a commission of inquiry led by Sir Hugh Foote, which strongly recommended that that policy must change. There must be an economic plan, and there must be economic development, and there must be political participation by the people. So within 5 years, all of what clearly Cooper had been trying to achieve had become normal. In reality, once back in Melbourne, he thought that he was paranoid because he feared that he was being spied upon. As it turns out, he was. But because he thought he was paranoid, he consulted a psychologist who diagnosed schizophrenia. And in April 1965, he committed suicide. And that's all I have to say about Cooper and Pyrmont. So, thank you for listening.